Greetings. Welcome to the Blue and Creative Leadership Summit panel on the Middle East, regional dynamics in the post-Arab Spring world. I'm David Andelman. I'm the editor of World Policy Journal. You'll find them out on the front table, and I encourage all of you to have a look. We have some interesting elements of the world of democracy in this issue. You know, 21 months ago, a lone pushcart vendor in Tunisia touched off a revolution that swept across North Africa onto Egypt and Syria, and it's still resonating so profoundly today. We called it the Arab Spring, and we were under the apprehension that this would mean the arrival of real democracy in the nations whose people had little or no firsthand experience in that concept, at least in any Western sense, and who we thought really lusted after it. Well, I guess we were pretty misinformed in some respects, and we'll let our panel deal with that in a moment. It seems like we've just swapped one proto-democratic system for another in many cases. Many of the same passions that energized those revolutionaries to turn on their leaders now seem to have turned on us in the West. And the question then is, did we do something wrong? That will just be one of the questions that we ask and hopefully answer today. Have we in fact been backing the wrong individuals, the wrong forces? Above all, is it still within our powers to change any of these dynamics? And then there's the wild card, as it has been for decades, Iran. You know, I was in Paris when Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran from France to change the nature of the Middle East, perhaps forever. Now it's within the power of his successors to do the same again. So do these events of the Arab Spring give these nations newer and more potent opportunities? This spring, along with one of our panelists, the good Jonathan Tepperman, I spent a couple of weeks in Saudi Arabia traveling around, including one whole day at the headquarters of the Ministry of the Interior in Riyadh. They were congratulating themselves on ridding their country of most of their internal terrorist threats by shoving them across their borders to neighboring Yemen and Iraq. Not a solution that I could see by a long shot, but that was their idea of a solution. So it's ironic today, and it seems after so much blood, American blood has been shed, even in the past week, Saudi Arabia may wind up being our most enduring ally and friend in the Islamic world. Yet another autocracy that is ours, perhaps not of choice, but necessity. So today, in the next 45 minutes, or I guess it's going to be closer to 40 now, I hope our distinguished panel will help us arrive at the best strategic choices to avoid a broader conflict. What new alliance systems do we build? How can blood that's been shed against Americans from Benghazi to Cairo or internally against their own people in Syria, how can that be halted? And how can we avoid distractions from the ultimate threat, a nuclear Iran, as we respond to the more immediate crises of the very moment? Today, the Blue End Summit has assembled a blue ribbon panel, so now I'll ask each of them to spend a couple of minutes, I'm very strict about that, I said 2 minutes each, introducing themselves first and then offering their own targeted prescriptions to the challenges that we've defined. Lally, why don't you start?
Okay, I'm Lally Weymouth, and I'm a senior associate editor of the Washington Post. And late last night, I returned from Turkey, where I interviewed Prime Minister Erdogan. He gave me a rare interview. And also, I was fortunate to talk to 2 members of the Syrian opposition. And as you all know in this room, Turkey is on the forefront of the fight against, or however you'd like to describe it nicely, against Syria, where the regime is basically, where the Erdogan has allowed the people fighting the regime, the opposition, to have their headquarters in Turkey. Plus, he's also allowed about 80,000 refugees so far to take shelter there. And this all started, as our host was just saying here, David, in the January, I think it was, of 2011. Turkey had a very close relationship, as you may remember, with President Assad, and Erdogan personally had a very close relationship with President Assad. And the United States went to him and said, after Arab Spring started, hey, what about it? How about cutting off this relationship? And he said, no, I won't. I want to see if they'll reform. And he was insistent on this, and he tried and tried for 6 months. He told me he had a 3-hour meeting with Assad. And I think that he believed that he personally could make Assad change. But by about September of 2011, he came to the conclusion that Assad was not going to reform, was not going to change. As he said, he was slaughtering his people. And he broke off all relations between Syria and Turkey, which was a really big deal because Turkey's policy, as you know probably, their foreign policy had been good relations with all their neighbors. And the business community in Turkey is extremely critical, actually, of the prime minister for, in a way, putting Turkey at the forefront of the fight against Assad. And so since that time, Turkey has hosted, as I said, the opposition groups, two members of which I met there. And the U.S. is providing what they call logistical support. Turkey, I think, there's a debate about how much. Turkey is definitely hosting the refugees, and they're also providing some support. Qatar and Saudi Arabia are also allegedly providing some support to those people fighting. But I was told by many people in Turkey that Turkey, at the U.S. request, is not allowing anti-aircraft weapon or heavy weapons to go into Syria. And so I asked the prime minister, well, how can you win a fight with blankets? I mean, it's really nice, but, you know, and he really doesn't have an answer to that. And I know that what he wants to do now, and what he's asked the international community to do, is back him and create a no-fly zone, a buffer zone along the border of Syria, where it would be a safe refuge for people trying to flee President Assad. And there was supposed to be a resolution introduced a couple of weeks ago at the UN at the request of the French foreign minister, but I think the U.S. withdrew the resolution at the last minute. So therefore, and the U.S. explanation would be, which is true, of course, that Russia would have vetoed this resolution. Because Russia, of course, Russia and Iran are arming President Assad in his regime. So Turkey courageously has cut off overflights, supplies going from Iran to the Assad regime. Maliki in Iraq has allowed these overflights to continue. So the Iranians can fly over Iraq and resupply the regime in Syria. And so we're kind of at a standoff. And I think that although nobody is willing to say this until the election is over, nobody is going to get involved in helping the Syrian opposition with arms. And also, I think one question that we might all consider this morning is, I really wonder, and I think Turks were wondering out loud, is how is the death and how are the attacks against the United States embassies in Libya and elsewhere going to affect the views of Americans if Obama or President Romney or whoever's elected were to say, well, now we really should help the Syrian people? Because Syria, unlike Libya, I might point out to you, is a strategic ally of Iran. So breaking Syria off from Iran would be a great strategic event for the United States. It would mean that we cut off their arms supplies to Hezbollah in Lebanon, to Hamas in the West Bank. So in a way, I would say coldly that it's much more important to the United States strategically than Libya. I would make that argument. Okay. And so I leave it up to you. And anyway, it was a very interesting trip. Erdogan was very passionate, very interesting. Although soldiers are being killed by the PKK terrorists every day in this country. So thank you very much.
Okay. Daniel, I think you have an interesting perspective from perhaps other parts of the region.
Thank you, David. I'm Daniel Pipes. I'm president of the Middle East Forum. And I thought I'd take two topics in my couple of minutes. First, the current wave of unrest. I see this as the follow-up on the Rushdie, the edict against Salman Rushdie by Ayatollah Khomeini in 1989, which came as a complete surprise, but has since been replicated over and over again and has become democratized to the point that, say, a pastor in Florida can decide to burn a dollar Quran, and there are eruptions in Afghanistan, or the weekly French magazine Charlie Hebdo can decide to have caricatures that came out yesterday of Muhammad naked, and the French government has decided to close down 20 missions and embassies in diplomatic missions in 20 countries. It's building up. There's more and more of this. It's democratized. Anyone can burn a Quran. Anyone can make a little film, and it's happening. Anyone can lead a counter-protest in the Muslim countries, and I think this is going to become part of the fabric of Western Muslim relations. Major point would be about U.S. policy vis-a-vis the Middle East. There are a lot of countries, there are a lot of situations. I would offer three imperatives, three guidelines. One is always, always, always oppose the Islamists. The Islamists are the totalitarians of today. Just as we always oppose the Nazis and always oppose the communists, we should now always oppose the Islamists. It's easy, simple guiding rule. Doesn't mean you always have to be in a state of war, but it means you are always against their interests. Secondly, always, always, always support the, what I don't know what to call them, the liberals, the moderates, the moderns, the people in Tahrir Square. They are our friends, they look to us, they are the potential solution to the problems of the Middle East. These are modern people who are not conspiracy-minded, not extremist. They're weak, they're nowhere near the corridors of power, but they are ultimately the answer. So always oppose the Islamists, always support the moderates, the moderns. And then the third guideline is somewhat more subjective and more difficult to apply, which is how does one deal with the dictators, the tyrants? And here I'd say deal with them, the Mubaraks and the Gaddafis and so forth. Deal with them, work with them, but always push them in the direction of opening their societies to the political participation. Always push them towards civil society. Always push them towards rule of law, independent judiciary, minority rights, freedom of speech, and all these things that are so counterintuitive and yet so critical. So always oppose the Islamists, always support the moderns, the liberals, and work out a way to deal with the tyrants so that you work with them, yes, but you push them in the right direction. For example, with Mubarak, had we done that when he came to office in 1981, over the 30-year period, Egypt would have looked very differently from the way it did look in 2011 when he was overthrown. Thanks.
Very good. Jonathan?
Thank you, David, and thanks to all of you. I'm Jonathan Tepperman. I'm the managing editor of Foreign Affairs magazine. 3 minutes or 2 minutes is barely enough time to order a cup of coffee, let alone expound on the future of the Middle East. So I'm going to make just a few quick comments, and I'm going to limit myself to the events of recent weeks because I think they risk changing the public narrative or the understanding of what's going on in the United States in a way that I think would be a big mistake. So let me make a few quick points. First, while the recent violence in the Middle East has been unsettling and truly disturbing, it would be a mistake to think that this is all about the United States. I think that the United States, of course, was the immediate, the approximate cause and the target in Libya and in Egypt. But what we're really seeing is a civil war being waged between the moderate Islamists who are now in government, the former and current members of the Brotherhood in Egypt and in Tunisia, the moderates in Libya, and the Salafis, the Saudi Wahhabi-inspired radicals, the extremists who reject multi-party democracy, who reject any kind of accommodation with the West, who reject pluralistic societies. Now, the Wahhabis have a big disadvantage, which is they recognize that they're not so successful at the polls. They managed to score no more than about a quarter in the recent Egyptian election. What they do have, and the one powerful arrow in their quiver, is this ability to mobilize massive street protests. And so this is what you saw last week, an attempt by the Wahhabis and the Salafis to get the people out into the streets, ostensibly to target the United States, but really to target the moderate governments in these states, to try and delegitimize them, to try and embarrass them, and to try and drive a wedge between them and the West. My second point is what happened next. The government in Egypt, for example, initially the Brotherhood government tried to ride the tiger, but it very quickly discovered what a dangerous game that was. And so you saw within a day or two an about face with the government starting to try and tamp down the protests and to limit the violence. Here I want to make a contrast between what happened this time and what happened in 2006, when you had widespread protests across the Muslim world against the Prophet Muhammad cartoons. That was still in the age of the autocrats, and once the fires got lit, they burned for days and days. Here, by about day 2, you saw this massive upswelling of counter-protests, and these very interesting incidents in Libya and Egypt and in others of ordinary Egyptians and Tunisians and Libyans getting up and saying, hold on a second, we are angry about this video, but these violent protests, this is not us, and this is not being done in our name. And you didn't see that in 2006. And that's, I think, a big sign of progress. And then the third point that I want to make is about the nature of these Islamist governments that are now in power, who are, I think, modernizers and are moderates. And here I'll quickly draw on an anecdote. Late last month, in late August, President Morsi, the newly elected president of Egypt, went to Iran. This was despite the opposition of the West, and there was a lot of hand-wringing among Western pundits that this was a sign that this guy who the West had helped bring to power was decisively breaking with his American backers, and that the Arab Spring was turning into something much more sour. But a funny thing happened when Morsi went to Tehran. Rather than using the opportunity to bash the United States and bash the West as people expected, he proceeded to beard the lion in its den. He refused to accept Ahmadinejad's characterization of the Arab Spring as an Islamic uprising. And he said, no, this is number one, Arab, and number two, this was about human dignity and rights. And religion, yes, but religion as a secondary force, not a primary force. And two, he proceeded to lay into Assad, condemning him, saying it was time for him to go, and criticizing in strong terms all those countries that continue to support him, the prime example of which, of course, was his host in Iran, the Iranian government. The moral of the story, and what this all says, is that we still don't know what's going to happen with the Arab Spring, but we are going to be surprised, and we're going to continue being surprised. We know that the enervating and brutal days of the Arab dictatorships are over. We know that there's now a battle raging for the soul of the Arab world between the Salafis and between the Moderizers. And whether we get an new Islamist age or something in some of these countries that looks more like the Turkish model remains to be seen. Like Zhou Enlai famously said about the French Revolution, it's still too soon to say. So what does this mean for us? What's the headline? Here I'm reminded of a joke that Shimon Peres, now the president of Israel, liked to make about the Middle East peace process. He would say, ask me how the peace process is going in one word, and I'll say, good. Ask me how it's going in 2 words, and I'll say, not good. I would invert that here. The big headline for the Arab Spring, at least today, is not good. But the underlying story, in 1 word, is good, or at least pretty good. Thanks.
Sanjeev?
Sure. I'm Sanjeev Berry. I'm the Middle East North Africa Advocacy Director for Amnesty International USA, and it's a privilege to be with my esteemed colleagues on this panel. From our perspective and also from my personal perspective, I think there are 3 broad sort of elements that one should keep in mind when taking in all of the information and both the highs as well as the tragedies that have occurred across the so-called Arab Spring, the popular uprisings across the Middle East and North Africa. It's a time in which some societies have been able to kick aside dictators. It's also a time of great tragedy, as with the deaths of the U.S. ambassador to Libya and 3 other Americans in the consulate in Benghazi. The three, I think, points that are worth keeping in mind as one interprets the events are first, avoid thinking in monolithic terms. There's a lot of buzz to be created by headlines like Islam versus the West versus Iran, Shia versus Sunni. But from my perspective, looking at the human rights issues on the ground, frequently these sorts of monolithic frameworks of binary ways of thinking, one versus the other, obscure more than they illuminate. And that there are significant developments on the ground across multiple different societies with different trajectories that get hidden if we think in those big terms. The second point that I think is worth keeping in mind, in addition to avoiding thinking in monolithic terms, is to approach all of the challenges that are being faced across the Middle East and North Africa from a universal perspective of human rights. And of course, it's no surprise that the Amnesty International person is going to say that. But what I mean by that is that whether one is criticizing the horrendous atrocities, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity in Syria, or the terrible repression in Iran, both countries, both governments, of course, happening to be adversaries of the U.S. government, it's also important to be even-handed and equally critical of human rights violations in those countries whose governments are allied with the United States, whether it's Saudi Arabia, the government of Bahrain, or even the Israeli government and its treatment of Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza, for example. And it's through this sort of a universal approach that we can actually move the needle in a direction that those of us who are engaged in public policy and international affairs can be happy about, which is the universal application of human rights regardless of who's in power, regardless of who's not in power, regardless of what government is trying to make concessions to what competitive faction that's at their heels in the new democratic environments that some of these countries face. And the last point I want to make, which is sort of connected to the second point, is that for those of us who in the room are people based in the United States, I know this is a mixed crowd of both folks based in the United States as well as international people of international backgrounds as well. It's important to have approach U.S. foreign policy with a healthy and skeptical posture of engagement. And what I mean by that is that right now, even as some of our own government officials are highly critical of the terrible atrocities that are being perpetrated in Syria, for example, more of a free pass is sometimes being given to the U.S. allies that are engaging in similar but perhaps much lower levels of repression. Right now, there's a man by the name of Nabil Rajab, who is a Bahraini, who was first put in prison for tweeting criticism of the Bahraini prime minister. Then that was dropped, but then given 3 years in prison because he had participated in 3 different peaceful protests. These are examples where those of us who are concerned and engaged citizens who want to be engaged in the political process and push for positive changes across the region need to make sure that from our perch, whatever our perch is, that we are holding the governments that we have the most access to accountable to the same standards that we want to see emerge and replicated across the Middle East and North Africa, so that the governments that we are most directly engaged with, whether that's the U.S. government for those who are based in the U.S. or other governments in other parts of the world, are playing the best role possible vis-a-vis their power and their interests and their assets.
This is all very interesting. I'd like to, to begin our discussion, I'd like to talk a little bit about the impact, not so much on the United States, but on the people of this whole region, which is a very diverse region. We had a visit 2 weeks ago from 8 young Libyan journalists at World Policy, and they were it was quite fascinating. It was before the Benghazi incident, of course, took place, and what they told us was that they found that post-Gaddafi, their reporting environment, their ability to function on behalf of their people and report on behalf of their people had never been in their lifetime more free and more liberal. At the same time, they also did not have a very good sense of where their country or their whole region was going, and that disturbed them more than probably anything else. So perhaps we can talk a little bit about that. Like, how do these people really see where they're going, and how is that likely to affect our relationships with these countries? Anybody want to start off?
Well, I'll make a quick comment, which is, I suppose it depends on who you talk to. If you talk to young Islamic radicals or just the profoundly devout, they feel pretty good because they feel like their people are empowered for the first time ever. If you talk to many of the women and the moderates who are in Tahrir Square, they're intensely anxious, and they have reason to be anxious. The great fear about Islamists in power was that it would mean one man, one vote, one time, and I think that fear is still very much in the forefront of the Democrats and the secularists or the pluralists who man the barricades at the beginning of the protests. The signs so far are equivocal. I would say in Tunisia and especially in Libya, they're surprisingly good. I would say in Egypt, they're much more mixed.
Well, you have some thoughts? Yep.
Me?
Yep.
Well, yeah, I don't think they're good at all in Egypt. I disagree with you entirely, and I think it's totally unacceptable that that they allowed our embassy to be stormed, which they did, and they could have stopped it. And I don't understand your remarks about Libya too, because it's fairly clear now that Al-Qaeda was involved in the attack on the embassy, and that it was a planned attack. It wasn't just, a few elements here. So it seems to be a guy who got out of Guantanamo, who was a member of Al-Qaeda and led the attack, and they came to our embassy heavily armed.
Right.
And so, I think it's actually really, from the American point of view, unacceptable.
Well,
and
yeah,
outrageous.
What these young journalists said was that they personally did not feel
Yeah, but
it was a
that's great.
security threat.
But the U.S. ambassadors,
the
yeah.
U.S. Oh, absolutely. But foreign forces there might indeed feel these kinds of threats. So that's the question of how do we kind of mediate between our interests in those parts of the world and their own interest for some kind of a personal sense of security and going about their
You
daily
might ask,
lives.
in the first question, first place I would ask, what was our national interest in Libya?
Okay.
If you can answer that.
Well, no, you were recently there.
Well, I would say we had no national interest in Libya
Okay.
because, the oil, whatever you think of Gaddafi, and he murdered Americans, and one was a friend of my daughter, so, he was a terrible guy. I interviewed him, he was horrible, I can say no more.
I've interviewed him twice, he
However,
was horrible.
he did give us he did turn over his nuclear program to the United States, and everything that we know, that the U.S. government knows about AQCON and the AQCON network, which has been essential to all people working in proliferation, because as you in the room know undoubtedly, AQCON was the Pakistani, he was the father of the bomb, and had a very complicated network that was very, very hard to break down, and he sold parts of the bomb here and there. And so everything that the U.S. basically learned came from Gaddafi.
Let's talk briefly about the bomb then, because that I think, is the sort of an underlying sort of a basso continuo in a lot of these areas. And we were in Saudi Arabia. We had, Jonathan and I both asked a lot of different people, what's going to happen if Iran gets the bomb? Does Saudi Arabia then get the bomb, right? And the answer was AQCON. We pick up the phone, we call Pakistan, and there are 6 bombs, that we have at our disposal, and within 3 weeks. Daniel, how do you see that playing out? You're very interested in that part of the equation, I think.
I think the prospect of the nuclearization of the Middle East is very high should the Iranians get nuclear weapons. And that is one of the many reasons why we don't want the Iranians to get nuclear weapons. And we shall see in the next few months whether the Iranians will get weapons or not. Let me take a point that you made about human rights up. Yes, I think it's perfectly reasonable for an advocacy group to look at all countries without favor or disfavor as to what the regime is and relations with the regime. Fair enough. It's an impartial, objective view. But from the point of view of a policymaker, does that make sense? We have interests. It's a difficult world out there. And if we deal with our friends and if we turn against our friends, or friendly, I shouldn't say friends, if we turn against states with which we have good relations and create a divide on the basis of human rights, we suffer. Our interests suffer. The perfect case is Jimmy Carter and the Shah of Iran. We got the Ayatollah. Was that really a good idea? Did our interests, or for that matter, the Iranian interests, benefit from that? So yes, from your perspective, be objective, look at everybody in the same way. But from a policymaker's point of view, I don't think you really want that to happen. You want there to be some sense of who one can work with and who is hostile. And
Daniel, what do you think the likelihood is of Iran getting the bomb?
Or the Israelis striking.
Or the Israeli striking?
This is the $64 question. My inclination is to say that the Iranians will not get it. Something is going to happen that will prevent them.
What?
Just one quick thing. I appreciate your comments with regards to the difference between heads of state and decisions that heads of state and national security planners have to make as opposed to advocacy organizations. Perhaps I should be a little bit more clear. It's one thing for heads of state or governments to have relationships and engagement, right? The challenge is the slippery slope. And I think a really good example of the slippery slope is what has happened in Saudi Arabia, where everyone from President Obama to even Ban Ki-moon issued praise to the Saudi government for some of its counterterrorism work. Now, it turns out that same counterterrorism infrastructure under the Ministry of the Interior is also used to silence legitimate dissent. And so to the extent that governments that espouse values of human rights or democracy are potentially in the slippery slope of being enmeshed with bureaucracies that are actively engaged in repressing the expression of those very values, then the external government becomes complicit. Now, that's different than simply getting on the phone and having a conversation about military issues or geopolitical issues. But where Amnesty International gets concerned isn't just that country A has a conversation with country B. We're not saying that the United States should stop talking to China, right? But what we are saying is that where the United States is transferring weapons, for example, to a government that has a significant probability of turning those made in the United States tear gas canisters, as were found on the ground in Tahrir Square in Egypt, that's where the problem is. It's that intersection.
Now, you've all raised a lot of these problems. But before we turn to the audience, let's very quickly suggest what are some of the solutions? I mean, we haven't arrived at any solutions, and this is one of the great values of this of the Blue Summit is to try to arrive at some kind of potentially some policy solution, something we can tell our leaders that they should be doing. Lally, you have lots of policy ideas very often. You've just come back from a place that relies heavily on what the United States thinks. What should we be saying?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and I'm afraid that I would have to answer, and I don't know if Daniel agrees with me, that all bets are off until the election, and maybe on both sides of the aisle, not just on Obama's side, but clearly on Obama's side, the Syria issue is dead until the election, as far as I can see. And Romney certainly.
And then what happens after that?
And then I would more or less agree with Daniel, or he didn't say exactly, but I would assume he agreed. The biggest issue in the Middle East really is what is going to happen to Iran's nuclear weapon. Is it going to be allowed to get the nuclear weapon? Is the President of the United States going to allow it to get a nuclear weapon? Because
is anybody going to not be able to prevent it from getting a nuclear weapon?
Yes, the United States could definitely prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Israel can strike some of the program, but in order to, as I understand it, at least from talking to experts there and here, in order to strike underground where the enriched uranium centrifuges are hidden, you really need the buster bunkers that belong to the U.S., so you'd really need a joint operation. And I believe really the United States would have to be involved in that. And so it's, in the end, a United States decision, I believe, although Israel could, of course, strike first. And I defer to Daniel.
Either can strike. Both can just delay it. The Iranians have the skills and the materiel to recreate the program. So anything one does only delays it. Presumably the U.S. attack would delay it longer, maybe much longer than an Israeli attack. But an attack in itself would be such a major event, it would have so many repercussions that it would change the dynamics. Let me just add, I did give you my policy ideas before, the three of the guidelines. Let me just differ a bit from Lally on the question of Syria. I think we should stay out. I appreciate the benefits of getting rid of the Assad regime, which is a foul, miserable regime. Nothing good to say about it, or the father of the current ruler. Miserable, miserable, miserable. On the other hand, I worry about the Islamists taking over in Syria, and I worry about even more trouble. And I see that there's certain benefits to having, again, looking at it not from a humanitarian point of view, but from a strategic point of view.
Can you ever put Syria back to where it was if you don't get rid of Assad? And if not, then what should the United States
I don't want to help Assad by any stretch of the imagination, but I also am not entirely enthusiastic. I'm not enthusiastic about helping the rebels. By the way, the rebels had their own demonstrations against us a couple of days ago because of the movie. We don't have a dog in this fight. And there's nothing in the United States Constitution that says we have to be engaged in every single foreign problem. Sometimes we can just sit it out. I think this is a case where we should.
Okay, we have 7 minutes. I'd like to, and with all due respect to my two colleagues on the end, we can come back to that. But I'd love to open it up to some questions if anybody from the floor has any. And please make it a question and not just a remark. So, anybody?
Yes.
Yeah.
What does Amnesty International, how are they getting?
Wait until you get a microphone. And could you identify yourself, please?
Name is Rhoda Shaloff. Does Amnesty International get involved with what's happening to the Christians in Muslim countries, the Coptic, the Egyptian Coptics, and all sorts of other areas where the Christians are under attack?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we face the same, we face, as large of an organization as we are, we still face basic challenges in terms of where we can focus our attention to do the documentation to verify when human rights violations happen. But I think a good example of where Amnesty International was very involved was with the Maspero incident, in which the SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces in Egypt, before the Muslim Brotherhood took over the reins through the current president, brought out armored personnel vehicles and literally just ran over Coptic Christian protesters in the streets. And to date, there hasn't been any significant accountability to speak of. And so we're very concerned about the treatment. Was that me? We're very concerned about the treatment of minorities or minority groups, whether it's in Egypt or whether we're talking about minorities that are that were on the wrong side when Gaddafi was overthrown and have been targeted by some of the militias in Libya today. But absolutely.
Lily?
But hang on just a second. All the human rights groups, as you know better than I do, were actually were arrested by this regime, and even the son of a cabinet minister was arrested, and the United States couldn't get them out for weeks.
Wait, which regime?
This Morsi regime. We couldn't get them out. We had to negotiate for months. Finally, we got them out. Gary Ackerman got them out.
That was the SCAF. That was the.
And it was not.
It was the SCAF.
Okay,
It was
whatever.
It was the military.
Okay, fine.
It was
But
Mubarak
when I was
administration.
there, I was there, and when I was there, the Salafis were cutting the ears off cops. And I think your question is well intentioned in the sense that we should be very concerned about Christian minorities.
Yeah,
but I don't
agree.
think the amnesty has the slightest power in Egypt. You don't mind my saying so, even though you're on the right side.
Okay.
Jeff Weisenfeld, I'd like to ask a question of any of the panelists. It's a completely different aspect of this topic than any that all of you have addressed. Intergenerationally, from the World War II generation, when there was an unequivocal divide between evil and the Allies, what has changed, in your opinion, where governments, and that is the key, have some specific and special sensitivity to Islam versus the other faiths? For example, Mel Gibson, I can tell you as a Jew, I don't care for him, but I'm not out in the street to kill him. Depictions of the Virgin Mary, I'm sure Catholics are not pleased with that. Every religion takes its insults, can protest very loudly, but there is a sensitivity that has infected the policymakers. Where have we come that our policymakers, like Ambassador Rice and others, say that the film inspires Islamists, massive numbers of Muslims around the world, to attack us, to murder our allies, to act in barbaric fashion, to rape Lara Logan, you name it.
What's your question, sir?
The question is, what has changed that there is a tolerance of one specific faith that drives our policy and false claims are made to defend behavior for one group as opposed to others?
Well, it's what I call the Rushdie rules that were set in 1989 and have been reaffirmed over and over again. A cartoonist in Washington State has everybody draw Muhammad Day and then disappears because she's threatened. A French high school teacher writes something critical of Islam and is under police protection after that. Over and over again, the message is being sent that if you do something that the Islamists don't like, then you will pay a price for it. But what's so striking, as I mentioned earlier, is that there are increasing numbers of Westerners who come out and say, I don't care. I just noticed yesterday that there's someone in Spain, a former Muslim, who's got a website called World Without Islam, and he said he's going to make a movie that's going to make the last movie look like, child's play. So you have provocations and you have responses, and this is a dynamic that is increasingly intense, and I think we're going to see a lot more of it. But the reason is that there is these acts of violence, these threats, starting with Khomeini's edict against Salman Rushdie and continuing onward. It doesn't exist anywhere else.
We have 2 minutes. Another question? One more question? Jared?
Hi, Jared.
Wait for the microphone. Is there a microphone? Down the front row.
I'm Jared, World Policy Journal. I was curious about the idea of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the idea that now we have these new regimes coming in. The notion that Israel, for the longest time, had to take the onus of the Palestinian question has kind of created even more burdens for the country, not to mention security matters from Hezbollah and Hamas. Why hasn't other Arab countries stepped up, because they have as much a responsibility toward refugee situations and as much of an onus and responsibility as much as the Israelis? So I'm wondering why Israel perpetually is put into that position.
I'll speak to that very briefly. I mean, the reason that it happens on a PR level is because Israel is a convenient whipping boy throughout the Muslim world, and there's no better popular play for an Arabic government than to castigate the Israelis publicly, because there is this deep groundswell of anger and hatred for Jews in the Israeli government across the Arab world. What's interesting is that under that, you see more subtle and nuanced positions among Arab governments. And one of the things that David and I heard when we were in Saudi, and that you hear if you talk to other Emiratis, for example, is that they would actually like to improve their relations with Israel, not because of any new wave of philo-Semitism that's spreading through the Middle East, but because they're terrified of Iran. And they know that the one country in the region that has the best chance of standing up to Iran is Israel. But what's standing in the way is this base of huge popular anger towards Israel for its policies in the West Bank and toward Gaza. And so I would submit, and I suspect Daniel will disagree with me, that one thing that Israel could do to improve matters would be to take steps on its own to try and to move towards peace with the Palestinians, which would either reduce popular anger in the Arab world, or would at least call the bluff of those who claim that it's all about the Palestinians.
And the irony, of course, is an attack by Israel on Iran would be applauded, no doubt, at least perhaps quietly, in places like Saudi Arabia. So I think we may have time for one more quick question. Yes?
Hi, my name is Aishwarya. I'm at Yale University. And my question is broader and maybe somewhat naive. But how does one balance foreign policy interests, which seem to be at the fore of a lot of the discussion, with plural ethics in policy? And if Iran is an example, then Afghanistan and Pakistan are also examples of short-term versus long-term thinking in holding consistent, somewhat moral, plural, ethical ground on the part of governments. So if someone could talk to how do you maintain short-term, maybe policy interests, and long-term ethical considerations in having all points of view balanced.
Do you mean by that, why hasn't the United States supported the opposition in Iran? Is that what you mean?
I mean, to Sanjeev's point and your counter to that point, that there are certainly foreign policy interests at play in when we deal with friendly nations. But I do think there is an ethical barometer that one has to keep in mind in terms of this turning into a monster in the future, maybe in the cases of Afghanistan and Pakistan.
You know, maybe if I can just jump in from my perspective, and I don't cover Pakistan issues professionally for Amnesty International, but having paid a little bit of attention to it over the years. I mean, Pakistan's political development is a great example. Each of the three military leaders who kicked aside, corrupt but popularly elected or selected prime ministers, each of the military generals over the history of Pakistan received support from the United States and had an alliance with the United States for periods of time. And I think Pakistan's dysfunctional systems of government now, in which the military is not subservient to the civilian leadership, we're seeing the fruits of the terrible fruits of those practices, which does not mean that the U.S. bears responsibility for those outcomes, but that certainly we weren't on the right side of the trajectory. The United States decisions. But so these are fundamental challenges, the philosophical versus the material, right? The geopolitical material interests that guide diplomats and strategic planners for any country versus the sort of longer horizon of morality, ethics, and philosophy. And I think at the end of the day, these are always works in progress, and they require engaged populations to elevate both the longer horizon of the ethical and the philosophical considerations, so that elected officials and appointed diplomats and security planners are sitting within that broader context and being held accountable to that broader context, even as they're focused on the geopolitical aims that they've been formally charged with.
I'd like to add one comment to that, which is, I think to some extent the troubles that the United States is having in the Middle East now are a direct result of the fact that perhaps we didn't get this balance so well in the past. The old days, the PT era, the pre-Tahrir era, we had a very cozy deal with the Middle East. We supported the dictators in the region, which allowed us to treat their countries like gas stations and garrisons. This was a good deal for us. It was a good deal for the dictators because they got money and arms and security. But it wasn't such a good deal for the people. And now that the revolutions have come, there's this broad-based anger towards the United States for our support for the tyrants for all of those years. The question is, how do you do it differently, and what should the balance be? And this is one of the most vexing issues for policymakers, because when it comes to strategic countries like Pakistan, for example, or Bahrain for that matter, we have a very difficult dilemma. On the one hand, we need these countries' strategic cooperation. On the other hand, we are a country of revolution ourselves with a profound commitment to human rights. But if we push too hard, we risk losing those countries and having them turn away from us. And I don't think that that's a gamble that a responsible American president could make. So you can push, and I think the United States could push harder, but you have to be very careful about the balance.
Well, you know, shockingly, we have not solved all of the problems of the Middle East in these 45 brief minutes, but we have certainly raised some interesting challenges for our leaders and those of the region. So we want to thank our four panelists, Lally, Daniel, Jonathan, and Sharif. And you can read our magazine out in front, free copies. I encourage all of you. And by the way, Jonathan's magazine's out there too. And Lally, you can read online at WashingtonPost.com. Excellent.
Thank you very much. You were very good.
Thank you very much. Thank you.